Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. And as always, it's a pleasure to have all of you back, and our newcomer is with us for the first time. As always, we'll start with the usual housekeeping rules. The meeting is being recorded, as you have been warned, because it will be posted onto YouTube. So if you don't want to be seen on screen, you can switch your video off, and please ensure that your microphones are off throughout the talk. As always, we'll have a Q&A session after the talk. The time is limited, so if you want to ask a question, our worshipful brother Cooper, use the hands up icon, which can be found in the top, in the bottom right. You can raise your hand at any moment during the talk, and as soon as you're called after the talk by the moderators, you can unmute yourself, ask your question, and move on. As always, we're giving away 2 of our bespoke mugs. For a chance to win, please answer the following question. What do the 4 veils of the chapter allude to? Please type your answer in the chat section, and the 2 first correct answers will win. Yes, chapter, Adrian, sorry. It's, actually there's several different interpretations to it, but there's one current mentioning. The chapter, the 4 veils are used in Scotland and in the York Rite, and I believe in Ireland as well, in the chapter. So without any delay, I'd like to introduce worshipful brother Robert Cooper, who requires no introduction, being one of the foremost Masonic researchers in the world. Brother Cooper took up the position of curator of the Grand Lodge of Scotland's Museum and Library in June 1994. In this capacity, he's a full-time employee in the Grand Lodge of Scotland. His position means that he is privy to many unique and rare documents relating to Freemasonry in general and Scottish Freemasonry in particular, such as the oldest records in the world, Lodge Ancient Haven, the Sinclair Charters of 1601 and 1628, the Shaw Statutes, etc. Brother Cooper has written or edited a number of books, including the international bestsellers such as The Red Triangle and The Rosslyn Hoax, as well as several others, and a number of Masonic papers. Brother Cooper was initiated in the Lodge of Light, number 1656, Scottish Constitution, as founding member of the past master of the Lodge of Edinburgh Castle, number 1764, of which he was master in 1998. He was master of the Lodge Sir Robert Moray, 1641, the Premier Scottish Lodge of Research for 2 years. During his term of office, he instituted a number of research projects in which members of the Lodge could participate. Also, speaking of research lodges, he is a past master of the Quattro Coronati Lodge, where he served in 2012 and 2013, the oldest research lodge in the world. He's a member of several Masonic progressive orders, such as the Great Priory of Scotland, the Knights Templar, the Royal Order of Scotland, the Supreme Councils for Scotland, the Grand Imperial Council of Scotland, and others. He's also a member of several other non-Masonic esoteric societies, such as the Free Gardeners, which he gave us a lecture on last winter, the Free Fishermen, and several others. Brother Cooper has been received and honored by many lodges and Masonic orders, such as, among many, indicatively, the Grand Lodge of Brazil, the Grand Lodge of California, Missouri, so on and so forth. So without any further delay and with great pleasure, Brother Bob, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that introduction. You've just cut 5 minutes off my presentation, but that might not be any bad thing, some of you might be thinking. It was almost some kind of premonition when you introduced right at the very early stages before this began, when you said you've got a meeting and this presentation has got to be shorter than normal. And just as well that I shortened it because nobody told me, but I shortened it a little bit. So let's get right to it. Very quickly, Rosslyn Chapel, as we all know, has attracted a lot of attention, particularly over the last 25 years. And it's the last 25 years that I'm going to focus on, if you like. So this is the history of recent history, if you like. Now we come to the technical bit where I try and share the screen to show you some images. And the reason for me showing you the images are twofold. One, you don't have to look at my ugly mug all night. The second one is that sometimes you get to see some quite nice images that go along with what I'm talking about. So if there is any problems seeing the title screen, which is an image of Rosslyn Chapel, if anybody has a problem seeing or hearing anything I've got to say, just shout out so that we can try and make it work. So I'm just trying to limit that guy and we'll minimize that. Right, so Rosslyn Chapel. First, we begin with a problem. And this is a problem that is common to nearly all Masonic historians. For example, we come across this a lot, and Rosslyn Chapel is a classic example of it. And here is the dilemma. I'm a Freemason and I'm an academic historian. So if a Freemason says to me, I believe, and leaves it at that, then I don't have a problem because that is his or her belief and there is nothing wrong with that. If he or she says, I believe that we are, say, directly descended from the Knights Templar and I can prove it, then what's happening is you're then stepping into my territory as a historian. Now, here's the problem. Do I, as a Freemason, have the right to tell you that your beliefs are actually based on incorrect facts? And this is a dilemma that I always have when giving a presentation like this. And unfortunately for you true believers out there, the hard-headed Scottish historian has won out tonight. So you're getting the hard-headed historian's point of view of this presentation this evening. So essentially, that is the dilemma, the conflict between a belief and historical evidence-based accounts. And it all began way back in 1987 with this particular book by Michael Bagent, the late Michael Bagent, with the Templar and the Lodge, where they made the first tentative suggestion of a connection between Rosslyn Chapel, Freemasonry, and the Knights Templar, etc. Now, see if we can get this little gizmo that I've just bought to work. I'll use the mouse. What happened after 1989, I should say, with Michael Bagent's book was a whole host of other books on the same theme suddenly appeared. Some of them were really quite startling in their content. Some of them were a bit more closer to what we would find acceptable. But as you can see from some of the titles there, we've been involved in the prophecies of Tutankhamun, the lost head of God himself, etc., all involving Rosslyn Chapel. The point I'm going to make here is, though, that you get to the very end image, the very last image, and in historical circles, there is a saying that once you get a story that is so popular that it ends up as a novel, then you know for sure that none of it is actually true. And Dan Brown, author of the Da Vinci Code, in fact, was very clever, because in his first edition of his book, he said that some of the contents of this novel, by definition, a work of fiction, some of the contents of this novel are based on fact, but he never actually spells out what is fact and what is fiction in his novel. And that gives us a big problem. So let me just show you how Dan Brown and many others have managed to weave fact and fiction together to come up with a very, very interesting story. And this is the story that we all, I think, know and love. You can see here, and I've put this, another reason for having it like this as images. It means that because it's being recorded, you'll be able to review it later. So anything that you miss or you don't hear or whatever, you'll be able to revisit the recording and catch up. Now, we know that there are certain facts. The Knights Templar were founded in 1118. They were arrested en masse by Philip the Fair of France. Philip the Fair, not because of his justice, but because of his complexion. And the story then goes that just before the mass arrests, some of them escaped to Scotland with a treasure that was being kept in the Paris preceptory. And the order was then officially dissolved by the church in 1312. So you can see you get fact, first thing's a fact, second thing's a fact, third thing is speculative. The fourth thing, the dissolution by the church, is fact. Fought at the Battle of Bannockburn, speculative. So you can see we're going from fact to speculation, and this weaves a truly wonderful story. Let me find how to get the next one. So before we go into detail about Rosslyn Chapel, very quickly, some basic facts about it. And as I say, you'll be able to revisit this when you wish. It was begun in 1446 by William Sinclair of Rosslyn. It was consecrated a collegiate church. The records for its consecration still exist. It was dedicated to St. Matthew. And when the builder of the chapel died in approximately 1484, William, succeeded by son Oliver, refused to continue with his father's work. It remained a private Roman Catholic chapel even after the Scottish Protestant Reformation in 1559. So it was a private chapel, so the new Protestant church couldn't take possession of it. It was private property. But even as late as 1690, the Rosslyn family were still adherents to the old faith, the Roman Catholic faith, and they retained their own family priest, Father Richard Augustine Hay, to whom I have to say we are eternally grateful for one simple fact. He copied the Rosslyn family papers that were in Rosslyn Chapel in the years prior to his death, and those copies are still with us to this day and tell us a huge amount of detail about the family, why they built Rosslyn Chapel, the lands they bought, the people they married, etc., etc. So let me explain, and this is crucial because most of the authors that we have mentioned, the popular authors that we have mentioned, talk about the church or the chapel as being in some way Masonic. What I'm going to try and do is explain to you why it's not Masonic. And I go back to the original records of the church when it was designated a collegiate church. And it's important, therefore, to understand today, and here's the problem, we're talking about things that happened more than 500 years ago. And many people now just simply don't know what the belief in faith was, what the church taught the faithful. They just simply don't know. I mean, and this can be summed up very simply. I suspect that probably 85% of us here tonight has never read the Bible cover to cover, whereas had you transplanted this presentation 500 years into the past, a very large number, certainly of the people who are listening, would know a lot of the Bible. So here we are, a collegiate church, and this is a very quick definition for you. And this is according to church teaching of the time. Quite simply, a church could be founded for the primary purpose of saying mass to get one's ancestors, or particularly near relatives, out of a place called purgatory, a waiting room, if you like. If you had been a very good person during your life, your time in purgatory was very short and you went to heaven very quickly. If you were not such a good person, your wait in purgatory could be very lengthy indeed. And one way to shorten that process was to have the church intercede, or a saint to intercede via the church on your behalf, usually your family paying a priest to say mass for you on a daily or weekly or perhaps monthly basis in order to shorten your stay in purgatory. There was no waiting for you, no waiting room for you if you were going to hell. At least, I suppose, if you got to purgatory, you know you were on your way to heaven. There was no waiting room for hell. You went straight to hell, and that was that, done and dusted. So the more prayers and masses that were said on your behalf, the faster you got into heaven. And this is what the church taught. And so collegiate churches were built primarily by families like the Rosslyn, the Sinclairs of Rosslyn, in order to employ priests, and they had they employed six priests to say almost continuous prayers and masses in the chapel for their deceased family members. And of course, they were addressed to their favourite saints, who were asked to intercede not only for the people who had passed away, but for those who were alive and alive and kicking at the moment, again, in order to shorten their time in purgatory. So these churches were very specific, for a very specific purpose, and they could even be within an existing church. Rosslyn Chapel is one of an unusual one. It was for the exclusive use of a particular family, the Sinclair family. Now, what is not realized is that, a little bit more information about the chapel. What is not realized is that not only was it used for saying prayers, it was also a burial place for members of the family. And what happened was, when you think about it, God's house on earth was a church or a chapel. So the nearest people like you and I could get to God on earth was to be buried in God's house. And so not only was the chapel built for the saying of masses and prayers for members of the family, it was also a place where members of the family were buried in God's house. The church, Rosslyn Chapel, was dedicated to St. Matthew. All aristocratic families, or nearly all aristocratic families, had their own particular favourite patron saint. In this case, the Collegiate Church of St. Matthew was what the Rosslyn family decided on. And this has a great bearing on some of the interpretations that I will mention fairly shortly. The Gospel of St. Matthew, and I do encourage you all, maybe not immediately after this presentation, but I do encourage you all to find time to pick up the Gospel of St. Matthew and read through it. It's not a huge Gospel. Well, for us today, it probably is about 14,000 words. But the thing I would like you to perhaps pick up on is Matthew's focus on blindness, and I'll explain why in a little while. Let's go back to some of the speculative things that have been said about Rosslyn as it exists today. People like Knight and Lomas say that Rosslyn Chapel, as it stands in the present day and age, is a replica of King Solomon's Temple, and it's a replica for one simple reason. It was in order to give a fitting place to hide or keep safe the treasure that the Knights Templar had brought back from the Dome of the Rock when they had been barracked there from their foundation in 1118. What the treasure is never said, but there are various claims as to what the treasure might be. It's variously claimed to be the Ark of the Covenant, the Holy Grail, actual gems or gold, etc., of vast wealth, etc., etc. So this idea that it's actually nothing much to do with Christianity at all has gained a huge amount of traction since Michael Bagent and his co-authors were writing in the 1990s. What they don't realize, and this is where people like me become a pain in the ass, a historian comes along and says things like, well, what about? When we look at church design, and this is common across Europe, most churches of the period are based on the outline of a cross. And you can understand the logic of that. This was the cross in which Christ was crucified. So the vertical head of the cross, the short vertical head, is known as the choir. The arms are the right and left transepts, and the long shaft is the nave in architectural terms. So when you compare this to this, then you begin to see, well, there is a certain similarity. It was never identical to the actual cross on which Christ was crucified. The point here is that what you're looking at on the right-hand image is actually how the chapel would have been laid out had it been completed. The upper black half is what exists today above ground. The grey part are the foundations which remain in place. But the son, Oliver Sinclair, decided he was spending his inheritance on wine, women, and song, and not on his dad's folly called Rosslyn Chapel. And so what happened was the foundations for the entire chapel were actually laid out, but what happened was that Oliver decided not to finish it. So it was left unfinished, not deliberately, for the reasons that some people claim as a replica of King Solomon's Temple, just simply because Oliver Sinclair was not going to spend his inheritance on finishing it. It's as simple as that. And the ground plan that you see there has been the grey part in particular, has been excavated twice and detailed, once by the Royal Commission for Ancient Monuments and one by two very eminent architectural historians, and they've been meticulously drawn. So we can see that it was intended to be a complete church. It was never intended to be left unfinished. So this rough idea of a church following the proportions of the cavalry cross is important so that we understand that Rosslyn Chapel is not unusual in the sense of its design. It's important to remember that point. We also must remember Rosslyn Chapel is not unusual, not in Scotland and not in Europe. In Scotland in particular, there are 42 other collegiate churches, just like Rosslyn Chapel. This kind of fact, unfortunately, is rather inconvenient and very rarely mentioned by many authors who want to see things that are dear to their heart, shall we say. It was very common for the aristocracy, not just of Scotland, but of Europe as a whole, to have their own dedicated church for the saying of prayers and masses and burials of their family members. And the example here is Crichton Collegiate Church, which just happens to be a short distance away from Rosslyn Chapel. The Crichton Collegiate Church is almost identical in terms of the idea, the purpose, the function. Not only do they have their own church, but just like the Rosslyn Chapel family, their castle, just like Rosslyn Castle, is built very nearby. They typically are within eyesight of each other. And the idea, of course, was that you had a stronghold during turbulent times in which to protect yourselves and your family, but you also had a nearby church in order to worship. And as I say, have prayers and masses said for the souls of your deceased family members. Another very nearby collegiate church is one of my favorites, I have to say, is Seton Collegiate Church. And it too follows the same pattern as Crichton and Rosslyn, and it is very close, very nearby. On a clear day, you can see it from Rosslyn Chapel, and it's exactly the same in terms of form and function. Design is different, but the function is identical. The castle is off to the left in this picture, and the church, again, is for the saying of prayers and masses for the souls of the Seton, the Seton family, particularly their more recently deceased. The interesting thing about Seton Collegiate Church is, I'll come on to that, I've just realised. So what makes Rosslyn Chapel special? We've noticed it's not special in terms of collegiate churches. They're common across all of Europe. All of Christendom has collegiate churches. So Rosslyn Chapel is not special in that sense. So what does make it special? Well, it's simply this: the sheer abundance of its internal carvings. The most famous carving is the one that you can see to the right of the image, the apprentice pillar. And this is well known now, not only because of Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code movie or film and novel, but also because of the sheer number of visitors that they have, getting on for 500,000, I think was the last I heard, into this, and this is a rather small space. So let's talk a little bit about the problems that we have in accepting what some people say about things like this. This is the apprentice pillar. The tail goes, and this is according to Dan Brown and all the others. It goes like this. The master mason was asked by William Sinclair of Rosslyn to carve this very ornate pillar from a drawing that he'd acquired from somewhere. And the master mason said, "There's no way can I carve that from a drawing. I need to go and see the original." So, in other words, he conned William Sinclair into giving him a holiday in Rome to go and see the original pillar. Unfortunately for him, disaster of disasters, once he'd come back, having seen the original pillar, on his return, he found that his apprentice had actually carved the pillar in accordance with the design that William Sinclair had given him. And in a fit of rage, he killed his apprentice, and that has caused many authors to say that that is a clear indication that the third degree of our ritual, the third degree or the Master Mason's degree, is a clear reference in Rosslyn Chapel to Freemasonry. And because that's, we'll maybe see this in a minute, because that's the entered apprentice pillar, the one to the left of that's the fellow of craft, and the one further to the left is the master mason's pillar. And I can see the logic of that. However, and I'm not giving any secrets away here, but what we need to do is think about that particular story. Again, like collegiate churches, they are not rare. The story of the murdered apprentice is not exclusive to Rosslyn Chapel. It's common across Europe, and indeed, just down the road, 20 kilometres from Rosslyn Chapel, lo and behold, here you have exactly the same story of a murdered apprentice who was killed by the master mason building Seaton Collegiate Church. And that's the carving in Seaton Collegiate Church of the murdered apprentice. So the first thing to say is, A, the church or the chapel is not unique in the sense of what it is used for, and it is not unique in Europe, again, not because of what it's used for, and it's not unique for the stories that are associated with it. It's unique because of the abundance of the carvings. So let's look, because this is crucial in my opinion to understanding what's going on here. The claim that the murdered apprentice is equivalent to the Masonic legend of the murdered apprentice in the third degree, and I'm not giving you any crucial secret information here, but this is simply a tabulated a comparison between the chapel legend and the Masonic legend, and you'll be able to look at this because it's being recorded. You'll be able to look at this at your leisure, but I think you can immediately begin to see vast differences between the Rosslyn Chapel and other places legend of the murdered apprentice with our particular legend in the third degree. For a start, the person who is murdered is not of the same type. Anyway, I'm not going to read it all. I think you should look at it. There are one or two that are dramatically, obviously different. One was a murder, one was a suicide, etc., etc. So once you go into the detail of both stories, you can see that there are substantial differences between them. And those substantial differences are more than sufficient to make them two completely separate stories. I'm going to just pause while you have a quick look at that. Okay, so here I'm going to make a statement that's going to shock you all. And that is simply this: there is no Masonic symbolism whatsoever within Rosslyn Chapel. Okay, so for those of you that have just fallen off your chairs and missed it all, here it is again. There is no Masonic symbolism within Rosslyn Chapel, none whatsoever. And here we go to a problem of definitions. And unfortunately, in this day and age, because the vast majority of people can read and write, the use of symbols is completely misunderstood, rarely used, and when it is, it's often used incorrectly. Many books describe the image that you can see on your screen as proof that an entered apprentice is being led into a Masonic lodge prior to his or her initiation. And they claim this because the figure on the right, if I can get it, is supposed to have a blindfold, and you can see supposed to have what they call a cable tow from his neck to the hand of this guy here, and there's supposedly a cross on the chest of the person leading him. Now, the first problem we have is that this is not a symbol. This is a carving. And so I've never been in a Masonic lodge that depicts that image as you see it in any Masonic lodge that I've ever been in. And that's because it's a carving, not a symbol. So if it's not a Masonic symbol, and it's not a Masonic carving, bear with me, it's not a Masonic carving, what is it? Well, back to our Saint Matthew. Saint Matthew, and again, this is why I mentioned that you might want to look at or read his gospel. He talks a great deal about blindness, and certainly during the medieval period, and indeed even earlier, artists and sculptors could not show a painting of a blind person. How would you know someone was blind? Very, very well. I don't think they knew. Somebody who's carving a human head with eyes, how do you make the eyes appear blind? Well, they simply adopted what they call the convention of the blind person wearing a blindfold. And the reason for wearing a blindfold ties in very neatly with St. Matthew, who talks about spiritual and physical blindness. And of course, a blindfold serves both purposes. The image you see before you could represent someone who's spiritually blind, that is blind to the teachings of the church, but it could also mean someone who is actually physically blind, whose eyes have been damaged and they cannot see. So in that sense, the image that you just saw, if it does in fact depict someone with a blindfold, the blind leading the blind is one of the more famous statements by St. Matthew. This could well be a statement of the patron saint of the chapel, of the blind leading the blind. So what all these books have got to say, including Dan Brown, Michael Bajan, Stephen Knight, and Robert Lomas, and Maurice Cotterill, many of these guys, they never talk about what it might be or it might have been to the people who were alive at the time. What they are doing is they're applying their Masonic knowledge of today onto the past. They hear the story of the apprentice pillar and say, that sounds very much like what we do in our lodge during the third degree. So there you go, there's proof that more than 500 years ago, the third degree was being worked by people in and around Rosslyn Chapel. The historian, the awkward sod, me, explains it to you from the point of view of what the Christian faith taught people, ordinary people, 500 years ago. And that, I think, in my mind, has a better explanation than some of the rather more speculative ideas that we've touched on tonight. If you really want to go into this in great detail, there is a book. I know that the Grand Lodge of Scotland has it for sale. It helps with insomnia, and it can also be used to prop up doors. But if you're a Scotsman like me, I would always first go and see if you can get out the library for free. Thanks everyone for listening. I hope you found that to be of interest. I hope I've left enough time to answer a few questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Bob. We have 5 questions, so we'd best make them snappy. Actually, I'm putting my hand down because I can ask you in private at some other time. So, Rob. Hello.
Hi. Hello. Bob, you said at the beginning that the Templars were arrested en masse. Did that occur in England?
No, this was in reference to France. It becomes a very complicated story, but very quickly you'll notice that Philip the Fair, King of France, is arresting members of an order of the Catholic Church, over which he's got no jurisdiction. Only the Pope had jurisdiction over the orders of the Church, then and now. So he arrests them, and eventually he twists the Pope's arm into issuing a decree arresting the rest of the Knight Templars all over Europe. And so eventually they were arrested in Scotland and England. I think 1309 comes to mind. There were trials of them here in England and in Scotland, but they didn't receive the same treatment as they did in France.
Thank you.
Great. Eric.
Hi, Bob. Once again, another great talk as ever from you. I suspect I know the answer to this question. In the legend of the pillar, we're told that the Master Mason goes abroad to see it. Has the location and the pillar ever been identified overseas?
The short answer is no, it hasn't. And I mean, the thing is, one of the problems that I have when I start researching this is I know that when I've got some information, there's going to be some people that don't like what I'm going to say. Now, here's the story about the apprentice pillar. The apprentice pillar is not carved in one single piece. It's carved in the form of donuts stacked one on the other, or polo mints for those of you that know what they are. And they are stacked one upon the other, and the seams of each donut, one on top of each other, are clearly visible if you look for them. It is a plain pillar, and what's been the carving, the decoration, has been applied later, and it's a technique called, surprise, surprise, applique. It's a way of adding carvings to a surface without having to go to the trouble of actually carving it out of solid stone. Anyway, long story short, no, I don't think the original ever existed. If it did, it was never replicated because, as we know, this is not a single piece of stone.
Yep.
Thank you, Bob. Colin.
Thank you. Bob, you say that there's no Masonic symbolism anywhere. By that, are you excluding the Mason's marks as having any Masonic symbolism?
Well, a Mason's mark isn't a symbol, it's a signature.
Yes, I agree with you that
so that even if you class a Mason's mark as a symbol, it's a symbol that is restricted only to a Mason, not Masons.
Right.
It's not a Masonic symbol.
I was trying to tease out the difference between Masonic symbolism and symbols of Freemasonry, which are completely different things.
Absolutely.
And I would have argued that they were Masonic symbols, but not symbols of Freemasonry.
Well, I don't think they're Masonic either. And here's the problem we have in Scotland. And I'd ask everyone in the audience tonight to bear this in mind when we're talking about Masonry in Scotland. And here's the problem. There are 2 types of Masonry in Scotland, as in accordance with our written records going back almost 550 years. There's 2 types of Masons in lodges. One are stonemasons, and the other are Freemasons. Now, stonemasons built Rosslyn Chapel, Freemasons did not. And therein lies a problem. When Dan Brown and the rest are talking about Masons, the whole world assumes they're talking about Freemasons. When you're talking about Masons in Scotland, you must be very careful about what kind of Mason the person is talking about. And if you bear that distinction in mind, then I think you get a little bit of clarity, hopefully.
Yep, you're
Thank you.
absolutely right,
Thank
Bob.
you, Bob.
I agree with you.
Time is really pushing, so we're going to take 2 more questions, as we said earlier, 5 questions only. Neil, and then Ornelio, and we have to close, make the closing comments. Neil.
Thank you, Brother Soteris. Brother Bob, do we know how many stonemasons were employed in the building and the carving of Rosslyn Chapel?
Not exactly, but the Father Hay, in translating the documents, did a great job of explaining how that went about. The builder of the chapel gave land to the stonemasons to build houses and land to grow crops while they were building the chapel. So it wasn't just 1 or 2 people, it was a substantial little village. And I'm putting my email address into the chat room in case anybody wants to email me questions they can't answer. But that's the short and sweet of it. Is we know a bit about the stonemasons he employed. They almost certainly came from Edinburgh, maybe some from France, but we don't know the exact numbers or the names.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bob. Ornelio.
Thank you, Sotiris. Brother Bob, I have 3 short questions. How big is the family of Sinclair?
Sorry, Ornelio, 1 question, please, because time's really pushing us and we're not letting other brethren ask any additional questions. So please, the most important one.
Right. The most important one is that the Sinclair family line died in 1778 when the first Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Scotland died in 1778. He had no male children, which meant that the title or the ownership of the land never went to anyone else, and it went to distant, very distant relatives with no blood connection whatsoever. What people don't realize, of course, is that Grand Master was buried with Masonic honors under the floor of Rosslyn Chapel. So the idea that nobody's been buried there recently is another myth.
But I have noticed in the Da Vinci Code, it said that it has connection with the bloodline of Jesus. Is that true?
No.
That's not, no.
No, I mean, that's an incredibly complicated question. You'd better email me, and that's about Jesus and Mary Magdalene and the south of France and all the rest of it. That's a whole different ballgame.
Thank you, Brother Bob.
Great. Bob, once again, thank you. It's always a pleasure to have you on board with us. Brethren, this Thursday, we're having our special edition by Worshipful Brother Matthew Christmas. The title is Over Troubled Waters, Bridges, Ladders, Towers, and Other Obstacles for Masons to Cross. Next Tuesday's regular talk is by Right Worshipful Brother Elkin Levy from Israel, entitled Freemasonry in Israel. Brethren, once again, thank you all for being with us. And if you have any further questions, our brother Robert Cooper has added his details in the chat. So you're free to contact him at curator at Grand Lodge of Scotland.
Can I just jump in here and just say next week's Tuesday's talk, brethren, we're going to be dedicating it to Worshipful Brother Clive Elliott. We heard the news of his sad passing away earlier on today by Brother Giovanni, so we'll be dedicating next week's talk to Worshipful Brother Clive Elliott.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Ahmed. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Goodbye from California.
Good night, Giovanni.
Good night, brethren.
Bye,
everybody.
Argentina.
Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.
everyone.
Thank you.
Good night. Good night.
Bye.
Good night.
Good night.
Bob, really
Thank
appreciate it.
you. Good night. Thank you and good night.
Good night from South Africa.
Good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody from Malaysia.
Giovanni, can you please remain in the room?
Bye.
Giovanni, is Giovanni still on? Is he gone?
Don't know.
Giovanni's gone, Maher.
You see, well, I've written to him. He hasn't responded.
I'll
Anyway,
give him a shout.
That's fine. That's fine. No worries.
What were the answer and who won the mugs?
It was on the chat group, Ewan. I don't know what the answer was. Sataris, where is he gone? Is he gone?
He's gone.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
The four Gospels.
No,
Yeah,
it's not.
that's not correct. No. The four Gospels may refer to the four banners, but the four veils refer to something completely different.
It refers to the four elements, and then friendship, union, fervency and zeal, and purity. So there are actually 5 that go with the veils.
Right, Ewan, Brian, you can pick it up with Sataris next week. It's nothing on the list. Dennis, don't worry, Dennis, we'll still get your mug to you.
Yeah, bow out gracefully, mate. Well done, thank you.
God bless everyone. Take care.
Well done.